We're not being imprisoned yet. We're not being hunted down and killed yet and tortured. But how many martyrs before us have? And it was just daily life. It was daily talk at the coffee and donuts for the first 300 years of the church history down in the catacombs. Yes, Bill got martyred last week. Yes, and Sarah got beheaded, and her sister, and this whole family, the Smith family, they were all fed to the lions, and they all died bravely, professing the faith. That was just regular news at Coffee and Donuts. And some who survived the tortures and were set free, like Saint Athanasius, he was taught catechism by Catholics who were tortured and survived. One had no eye, one whose hand was cut off because he wouldn't burn incense to the gods. That's who taught him the catechism. People maimed for the holy faith. So let's turn to an era not too long ago. In fact, Father Ruiz, his great-grandparents, fed the Cristeros, took care of them in their homes as they passed by. And Father Raphael, he is related, he has a great-granduncle who's a canonized saint, whose body is incorrupt. Saint Raphael Gitzer, who was a bishop who worked many miracles. And he has another great-granduncle who was a general, Jesus de Yogado. And he has another great-granduncle that was a general in there also somewhere on his mother's side. And I've known throughout the United States some of the old Cristeros who were related to the Cristeros. So let's cover this. It's an excellent article that was printed by the Angelus. They would never print this today, that's for sure. January 2002. It's too counter-revolutionary for the new SSPX. They would never print this ever anymore. This is the old SSPX, which we stay faithful to and tradition. The 20th century was the bloodiest century in history. The century of massacres. Think of Stalin in Russia, starving out the Ukrainians in 1932 to 33. Mao Zedong killing millions of Chinese. Hell's century, it's called. The century of martyrs, just like all the others? No, not just like all the others. The 20th century was the great century of martyrs, infinitely more than the others. Never had there been so many martyrs in the space of 100 years, not even in the space of 1,000 years. And these tens of millions of Christians, the victims of a century in open revolt against God, remain unknown and unsung. Today I would like to recall for you the Mexican Catholics who some 70, now 80 years ago rose up against Freemasonry for the social reign of our Lord Jesus Christ. They were called the Cristeros. So this was the first wave from 1926 to 1930. Calles was elected president, and here's a little bit of the history. And it's very important for us, for our fight right now, to look at these martyrs. A century of religious persecutions. From the time of its independence that was declared in 1821, Mexico had a troubled history. Civil wars, dictatorships, coup d'etat, revolutions. From 1876 to 1911, Maximilian's empire, from 1863 to 67, was but a brief and very imperfect parenthesis in the persecutions endured by the Church once the Spanish left. Property despoiled, priests imprisoned, assassinations plotted, bishops expelled. Why so many misfortunes? A proverb provides the answer. Poor Mexico, so far from God and so close to the United States. Because of all the Freemasonry in the United States and the White House in the grip of the Freemasons. The United States did not want a great Catholic power at their door. At the time of Mexican independence, they worried about this potential rival whose land mass roughly equaled their own, and whose population, though less numerous, 6.5 million of inhabitants versus 9.5 million, had become, thanks to a very lively Catholic faith, a true nation, while the United States remained, and remained even now, the salad bowl of all religions, the state neutral on matters of religion, and glories in it. But such a system as Pope Leo XIII condemned, Pope Pius IX condemned, Pope St. Pius X condemned separation of church and state, condemned freedom of the press, freedom of speech, freedom of conscience. Now, freedom of speech, that might hit you wrong because what's wrong with freedom of speech? Well, with the enemies controlling the media, we defend the right to speak the truth. For example, I've been kicked off of YouTube probably, I don't know how many times, 8 to 10 times now, because they're a bunch of Marxists. And anyone who speaks the truth, many doctors, nurses will never go back on YouTube. They're kicked off because they revealed the truth about the you-know-what in the arm. So we defend the right to speak the truth. That's the true freedom of speech. But the freedom of speech condemned by the church is like pornography. It's like the spreading of false religions on internet and on the TV and on radio, in the newspapers. Anyone can spew their filthy opinion and mislead many souls. So the Catholic Church has always condemned this because error does not have rights. Error does not have rights. What death more fatal for souls than the liberty of error? St. Augustine. What death more fatal for souls than the liberty of error? So that is the American system, but it wasn't at the beginning. Remember, long before the Plymouth landed on Plymouth Rock, the Catholic priests were already converting the Indians in New Mexico. The Catholic priests were looking into the Grand Canyon for the first time. And Father Juniper Serra was converting the West Coast. The great Spanish missionaries, the Franciscans, were landing on the shores of Florida. Florida has 54 martyrs. 54 martyrs. And it took 7 waves to start beginning to convert the Indians there, with alligators and jungles and mosquitoes and the rough terrain. And the missions were established all the way up to North Carolina. There was an old saying by the Catholic converted Indians, it's too bad the Plymouth Rock didn't land on the Plymouth, rather than the Plymouth landing on the Plymouth Rock. In the 1830s, war broke out. Betrayed by Masonic generals, Mexico lost its northern territory. California, Texas, New Mexico, 1848, was placed under United States political and economic hegemony. Another one I forgot to mention is in the mid-1600s, Blessed Maria of Agreda bilocated to teach the Indians in Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, and California. That's documented, and it's historic fact. It was documented by the Franciscan at the time. And these Indians in Curay region in north New Mexico and in Pueblo, you can still visit these ruins. In Pueblo, actually, you can see the church, San Agustin, south of Albuquerque. And the Indians made like 5 journeys to Santa Fe to beg the Franciscan priests, please come and bring us the sacraments. Bring us Mass, bring us baptism. And the provincial said, look, our priests are stretched so thin, we can't send any out to your Timbuktu land. After 3 or 4 waves of the Indians begging, they finally sent a priest. When the priest arrived, the whole village received him with celebration and flowers and dancing and shooting their arrows in the air. And the priest discovered they knew their catechism. And he would ask, how many sacraments are there? 7, Father, baptism, Holy Eucharist, confirmation, confession, da-da-da-da-da. What are the four, who are the four evangelists who wrote the Gospels? Oh, I know, Father, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And he would ask, what's the primacy of Peter? It's when Christ gave to Peter the keys of the kingdom of heaven. And the priests were amazed. They said, how in the world, you've never seen a priest, how in the world do you know the Catholic Catechism? And they said, Father, for 12 years we've been receiving this beautiful nun. We call her the lady dressed in blue. And she comes here to teach us the Catechism. And she knows all our names. And the provincial, Father, if I get his name right, Benavida, I think, or something like that. Alonso, he was the superior. I forgot his name. Benavida, or something like that. He did the research. And he went back to Spain to find this nun. And he found Agreda, he visited the convent, and he spoke to Blessed Mary of Agreda. And she said, yes, I know those Indians. I know the chief who had his eye poked out from an arrow. And I know the names of the children and the trees and the plants of the area. And in fact, she sewed some of these plants and trees into the vestments that she was sewing. And they were amazed because she was bilocating for 12 years. What mercy of God! What mercy of God! And they put a statue up of her in her honor in one of the towns of Texas where she was. So it's well documented, and it's a beautiful touch of God's mercy. The puppets successfully made presidents of Mexico were all corrupt Freemasons who immediately enforced the orders issued from Washington to defanaticize the country, that is, to destroy its Catholicism, which dated from the 16th century when the Spanish, especially the Franciscans, had evangelized Mexico. The order also demanded defiling the memory of its European heritage by exalting the pre-Columbian era and the marvelous, so-called marvelous Aztec civilization, where the wheel and the vault were unknown, but where slavery, human sacrifice, and cannibalism were practiced on a grand scale even in the 16th century. So when Cortez, the great Hernan Cortez, who the liberals can't stand, he was a real man and a real hero and a conquistador. Some of his men got some cold feet, so he burnt the ships on the coast of Veracruz. Their ships to get back to Spain. He burnt them, so that ended all hopes of going back home. So they were all committed to the mission. And think of it, his army of what, 500 men took a whole city of 3 million people. That's an amazing feat. Just that's an amazing feat of military strategy. But of course, Our Lady would appear in 1531 in Guadalupe, and she would bless the work of the priests and bishops, and Mexico would just take off with over 8 million conversions. And the Aztecs, who were excellent builders, excellent astronomers, excellent engineers, because they built Mexico City on a lake, a huge lake. It was a city on a lake with canals like Venice, and they'd go through the streets on their canoes. But they were excellent engineers, and they could read the image of the tilma. They could read the constellations of the stars. And they realized these constellations were not looking from earth to heaven, but from above the stars looking down to earth. And they saw the constellation Corona Borealis was on her head, Mary crowned. They saw on her heart the constellation of Virgo, Virgin. And they saw on her stomach the constellation of Leo, the lion, Christ, the lion of the tribe of Judah, in her womb. So they instantly converted, and there were miraculous cures. There were people raised from the dead by touching the cloth. And the cloth still stands, supple, and it should crumble like dried up spinach on the kitchen counter. It should just crumble after 20 years, but it's been there since 1531. NASA studied the tilma and said it's inexplicable, can't be explained. Scientists who put a stethoscope to it, right, they hear 2 hearts beating The heart of Mary, slow, and the heart of Jesus, fast in her womb. It's as if she's present in the tilma. It's amazing. The Freemasons tried to bomb it, and everything shattered. The altar smashed of marble. The crucifix was bent backwards, a big metal crucifix. The glass, the frame shattered, but the tilma was miraculously untouched. Untouched. And so that great tilma of Our Lady is a miracle, and it still stands, rebuking the modern world. It is said when Archbishop Lefebvre visited there, you know, they have the moving sidewalk in the new basilica, so you stand on it as you pass the image as you look up. So it is said with the society priest who received Archbishop Lefebvre, when he visited there, the moving sidewalk, right when he came before Our Lady's image, it stopped. And the janitors were getting upset with, oh, we got mechanical problems. But it just stopped for a few minutes, and he was kneeling and praying. And when he stood up, it moved again. So, quite amazing, this tilma, very beautiful. And it was the proof to North and South America that Mary is our mother, our tender mother. Here are just two examples of this policy. The first official act of President Juarez was to transform St. Francis of Mexico Church into a Protestant temple in 1867. And the publication of Pope Leo XIII's encyclical Humanum Genus, 1884, condemning Freemasonry, was prohibited even in the seminaries by the Masons. In 1914, President Carranza, put in place by the U.S., inaugurated a period of open persecution. Priests were massacred, 160 were killed in Mexico in February 1915. John Lind, L-I-N-D, one of Woodrow Wilson's advisors, rejoiced over the news. He said, "Great news! The more priests they kill in Mexico, the happier I shall be." An American pastor, indignant about the outraging of the nuns in Veracruz, received this reply from Wilson's personal representative, which said, "After prostitution, the worst thing in Mexico is the Catholic Church. Both must disappear." In 1924, Plutarco Elias Calles, that's C-A-L-L-E-S, became president. For this descendant of Spanish Jews, a 33rd degree Mason, the church is the unique cause of all Mexico's misfortunes, he said. For him, too, she had to disappear. With the complicity of a Masonic priest, Father Perez, proclaimed by the government patriarch of the Mexican Catholic Church. So notice they set up a schismatic church, just like we have a schismatic church called the Conciliar Church with Vatican II. Calles founded a schismatic patriotic church, as the communists were to do later in China. The wine used in the Mass was replaced by mezcal, but the maneuver was met with widespread contempt. The government could finance the opening of 200 Protestant schools, and Calles could smooth the way for heretical sects, that's Protestant denominations, already well financed by the U.S., but the Mexican people remained stubbornly attached to Rome. In 1926, the president and the clique launched a new offensive, which they hoped to be definitive. Now there must be a psychological revolution, Calles declared. We must penetrate and take hold of the minds of the children and the youth, because they must belong to the revolution. Now, isn't that happening today? All the sodomites with the libraries and grade schools, pushing all their perversion on these children across the world, and especially in the United States. They always attack the children. If your rear ends get sore, feel free to stand up. I know it's, after many talks, it affects the lower parts. So feel free to stand up if you need to. The Catholic schools were shut down, the congregations expelled, Christian trade unions forbidden, numerous churches confiscated and profaned, turned into horse stables or halls, or destroyed. Public school attendance became mandatory. Atheism was officially taught. And religious insignia, medals, crucifixes, statues, and pictures were forbidden even at home. Sounds like the United States today. Sounds like the U.S. in the public schools today, doesn't it? And they even get kicked out for wearing a MAGA hat. And that boy in Canada who stood up and just defended common sense at a Catholic school and said the boys belong in the boys' bathroom, girls in the girls' bathroom. Stop harassing the girls with boys in there because the girls don't want it. And he was arrested at his school, a Catholic boy who had some spine up in Canada. The use of such expressions as adios, which means if God wills, or God, which means to God, or expressions like if God wills or God forbid, was subject to a fine. Lastly, the priests were registered. Some states, Mexico is a federal republic, some states required them to swear not to proselytize, that is, spread the faith by catechizing. Others tried to command the priests to marry if they wished to continue in their function. Monsignor Caravana, the apostolic nuncio, protested. On May 12, 1926, he was expelled from Mexico. Throughout the country, Catholic public figures were assassinated, girls coming out of church were kidnapped, imprisoned, and raped. Monsignor Curley, the Archbishop of Baltimore, Maryland, vented his indignation. He said, "Calles persecutes the church because he knows that he has Rome's approval. Our government has armed Calles as killers. Our friendship has encouraged him in his abominable enterprise to destroy the idea of God in the minds and hearts of millions of Mexicans." So this is the Masonic goal, to eradicate Catholicism. Now they got a grip on Catholic Rome. Rome is in the grip of the Freemasons. Archbishop Lefebvre said this many times. Pope John Paul II wants a front seat with the one world government, he said. And they have it. Pope Francis is working in obedience to the World Economic Forum. He's obeying these wretched Masons, these destroyers, these heartless men. On May 28th, Calles received the Masonic Medal of Merit from the hands of the great commander of the Scottish Rite in Mexico. On July 12, 1926, the following communique appeared in the press, saying, "International Masonry accepts responsibility for everything that is happening in Mexico and is preparing to mobilize all its forces for the methodic, integral application of the agreed-upon program for this country." What's the program? Eradicate Catholicism. On July 26th, an elderly shopkeeper was coldly struck down by two policemen in civilian clothes. His crime? In his shop, he had posted a sign reading, "Viva Cristo Rey," long live Christ the King. The Mexicans peacefully reacted to the persecution. They boycotted state-owned enterprises. Tobacco purchases and railroad traffic were reduced by 74%. And in just a few weeks, the National Bank suffered a 7 million peso loss. Sounds like Budweiser, doesn't it? Don't drink another drop of Budweiser products. They don't deserve it. And they're being funded by you-know-who to keep promoting their perversion. Same with Target. We got to boycott these wretched programs and never bend or show support for this rainbow agenda. So goodbye, Budweiser. Welcome Dos Equis or Negro Modelo or Coors, I guess. And Yingling. Yingling is a good beer out of Philadelphia. And they also circulated a protest petition signed by 2 million out of a population of 15 million. Now, there's a priest who kept a marble as a relic of a 7-year-old boy. A 7-year-old boy was at one of the big processions that they had, praying the rosary and begging God to have mercy on Mexico. And after one of these processions, that the police would come and spray them with either rifles or the fire hydrant hose and scatter the processions. So this little boy was playing marbles with his friends, and the police officer walked up to him and said, "Son, take off that banner. It's forbidden." And he said, "No." And he ran home. And the banner was on his chest that said, "Viva Cristo Rey." So the policemen followed him, and they came to his house, knocked on the door, and his father answered, and he said, your son is wearing something illegal, and we ordered you to take it off. So the father said, Jose, come here. The policeman wants you to take that off. And Jose said, Dad, you always told us we got to be ready to die for Christ the King. And the officer took his rifle, pointed it down at the boy's face, right between his eyes, and said, boy, take that off now. The little boy with the iron back of a Samson and filled with the Holy Ghost looked up the rifle and he said to the cop, Viva Cristo Rey. And the cop blew his brains out right in front of his family on the doorsteps. So, a true hero and a martyr, and the priest kept that relic. But Christians have something even better than that. Boycotts. They have prayer. And the country was crisscrossed by gigantic penitential processions. 10,000, 15,000 faithful, barefooted, crowned with thorns, implored God for their country. The powers that be could not tolerate that. Their heavy machine guns dispersed the processions, and the first martyrs fell singing. Public worship suspended. On July 24th, 1926, Cardinal Gasperi sent a telegram from Rome to the Mexican episcopate. He was Pope Pius XI's Secretary of State, saying, under no condition we will accept the registration of priests. The bishops decided to suspend public worship throughout the land starting July 31st. All the places of public worship would be closed. There would be no masses offered nor sacraments administered throughout the country except in private chapels. This was an unheard of, inexplicable decision, unless by it they intended to push the Mexicans to revolt. For the one thing they could not bear was to be deprived of the holy sacraments. During the final days of July, people thronged the churches day and night, going to confession, getting baptized, marrying. The one reporter said, people began to come to put their consciences well in order, even though it was already time to begin working in the fields. With each passing day, more and more peasants streamed into the village from the neighboring hamlets, their pale faces and sorrowful eyes bespeaking their anguish. There were 3 priests in Taltegnango parish, not enough to confess so many people. Despite being in the confessional from dawn to dusk with no time to eat or rest, still they could not confess all who came. How surprising to see someone estranged from the sacraments come to receive forgiveness of his sins, and others who lived in concubinage came to seek out the confessors, asking to be united in marriage. And then the terrible hour came. This day there was to be a Mass at midnight, and by the end of Vespers the church could no longer contain the immense multitude of the faithful. One after the other, the faithful would go on their knees from the door to the altar. No one wanted to see this most dolorous moment arrive, but God was going to permit it to come to pass. At 11:30 p.m., the bells dolefully tolled the hour of the Mass. The nocturnal adorers, the pious associations, and the Catholic social organizations, with their groups and their banners, were there, as were all the faithful. At midnight, the Blessed Sacrament was exposed, and the Mass began. After the Gospel, our dear Father Gonzalez mounted the pulpit. He had barely gone up when all the people gathered at the foot of Jesus in the host began to cry. The broken words that the Father spoke, full of sorrow, were interrupted by sobs. After Holy Communion at the end of Holy Mass, we were given the benediction with His Divine Majesty in the monstrance. Mass. Finally, the Father, divested of his vestments, knelt at the foot of the altar, his eyes fixed on the image of our Lord of mercies. Silently he took leave of him and went out through the midst of the faithful. Christ and his minister had departed. From the first days of August, the Mexican people deprived of their priests, only 200 remained with their faithful. Only 200 faithful priests stayed. Many of them apostatized and signed the oath, going with the schismatic Mexican church. Just like after Vatican II, most bishops and priests went with Vatican II. And just like at the 2012 compromise of Bishop Follet with modernist Rome, with Vatican II, with the new Mass, the new sacraments, the new Code of Canon Law, the new Oath of Fidelity condemned by Archbishop Lefebvre, most of the bishops and priests went with that revolution also. It's easy to go with the flow. As Bishop Sheen said, dead bodies float downwards with the river, with the current. Live bodies swim upstream. And their bishops, only one remained out of 38. Most bishops were expelled out of Mexico. And Bishop Orozco, from a family of 15 children, he stayed among the Cristeros. He said Mass for them. And he got a letter from some cardinal in Rome saying, "Why do you lower yourself to live among these filthy peasants?" And he wrote back and said, "If you saw the faith of these peasants, you would compare it to the faith of the early martyrs." So he defended them, and he would anoint the dying, and many priests would stay with them, say Mass, anoint the dying, and the priests would preach the Maccabees. They would preach how similar the Cristeros situation was to the Maccabees of the Old Testament. And of their bishops used force to resist the inventorying of the closed churches and the accompanying sacrileges. Their rallying cry was that of the Mexican shopkeeper, "Viva Cristo Rey, long live Christ the King." To keep from hearing it, the soldiers had only one solution: cut out the tongue of those whom they were going to kill, of those whom, because of these shouts, they named the Cristeros. One of them wrote before dying, "We are going to perish. We will not see the victory, but Mexico needs all this blood for its purification. Christ will receive the homage which is due to him." Blood flowed. Ireland broke its diplomatic relations with Mexico. No other state followed suit. So there was the famous case of many young men, 16-year-olds. One guy was arrested. He was found. He was fighting with the Cristeros. They offered him bribes. He refused. So they offered him threats, and he refused. And they said, "Come and fight with us." He said, "No, I fight for Christ the King. Viva Cristo Rey." So one of the guards walked up to him, cut out his tongue, and his mouth was overflowing with blood. So with his right arm, the 16-year-old boy made the sign of the cross. And that made them more angry. And so they come up and chopped off his right hand. And with his bloody stump, he still made the sign of the cross. And so they just riddled him with bullets. 16-year-old. Another boy named Brigido was killed in battle and martyred. And in the town, his family and friends and the women covered his body with flowers. And there's photographs of that. On September 18th, 1926, Pius XI published the encyclical Iniquis Afflictisque, which said, "In narrating this, venerable brethren, we can scarcely keep back our tears. Some of these young men and boys have gladly met death, the rosary in their hands and the name of Christ the King on their lips. What a beautiful spectacle this is, that is, thus given to the world, to angels and to men." So if you remember the movie For Greater Glory, who here has not seen For Greater Glory? Just to get an idea. Okay. It's not excellent, but it's good. But the portrayal of little Jose at 14, that was very good. But the account of, I think his name was Victor Ramirez. His name was Catorce. In that showing of the movie, remember the guy that was in his house out in the country and the 14 federales surrounded his house and they had a big shootout? That was true. It happened. And he did kill them all. But what they didn't put in the movie was he wrapped up their rifles with a note sent back to the Federales Freemasonic headquarters, which said, "You'll have to send more than 14 next time." So his nickname became Catorce, which means 14. In October, the Holy Father, Pope Pius XI, declared, "The blood of martyrs has always been the seed of blessings from heaven." How could one fail to understand that 1 year after Quas Primas, the encyclical on the social kingship of Jesus Christ, in 1925, the Cristeros were signing with their blood this text on the social reign of our Lord Jesus Christ. Freemasonry understood it, and its American journal, The New Age, of December 1926, it expressed its stand, saying, "The Catholic Church has perverted the Mexicans for 400 years. Calles' merit is to have delivered them from ignorance and superstition. That is why he can count on our understanding and on North America's support." In January 1927, Catholic Mexico rose. 20,000 combatants, 30,000 by the end of the year, and 50,000 in 1929. Few weapons, a few rifles and carbines, but mostly hatchets, machetes, and sometimes simply sticks. Few horses, but all the people supporting them, offering them their money and necessities. A Cristero peasant recounted how they set out with songs and prayers on their lips. "We were 1,000, then 5,000, then more. Everyone set out as if to go to the harvest. We firmly intended to die, angry or not, but to die for Christ." The old men and children, unarmed, followed behind the troops in the hope of martyrdom. The parents of Nemesio and Isidro Lopez did not want to see them depart for the war for fear that their flesh would go to feed coyotes and eagles. But the boys replied, "The coyotes may indeed eat our flesh, but our souls will ascend straight to heaven." So in 2006, Father Tim Pfeiffer and 4 seminarians and I took 30 boys to Mexico. We rented a big tour bus and drove from San Antonio to Laredo, Laredo to Monterrey, Monterrey to Querétaro, and Father Raphael's father was kind of our guide through Mexico. So among many other things, I could not leave Mexico without meeting a real live Cristero. So Mr. Arriaga knew one in some town. So here we are driving this big tour bus and drove through this town looking for this old man. There he was with his wife drinking a Coke in front of his small casa. And all these boys got out of the bus and surrounded him. And he was wondering, what's going on here? What did I do? And Father Pfeiffer spoke to him in Spanish, Father Tim Pfeiffer, and we wanted to hear his story and meet him. So he was very delighted, and he told us when he was 14, he went with his father to fight. And he said one of their first campaigns was entering their village. They knew the federales were coming. They would hide behind the hedges on the side of the road. And as the federales came close to the town and passing the road in front of them, the commander shouted, "Viva Cristo Rey!" And they all jumped over the hedges and massacred the federales. So, and he said, till today, just to hear Viva Cristo Rey, he still had goosebumps. He had goosebumps because they were ready to die for Christ the King. They were really ready to die martyrs. What a great spirit. Against them were 100 mobile columns of 1,000 men each, veritable inferno columns financed by the U.S. Masons in Washington, D.C. Light armored cars, tractor-drawn artillery, combat aircraft was supplied by Washington. The first clashes were bloody massacres. An officer of Calles wrote, "They are more like pilgrims than soldiers. This isn't a military campaign, it's a hunting party." The president himself predicted it will be wrapped up in less than 2 months. But when a pilgrimage takes up arms, it becomes a crusade. The Cristeros were able to equip themselves from the adversary, profiting from their cowardice or their corruption. The federales were more like pillagers drunk on tequila and marijuana rather than soldiers worthy of the name. On March 15, 1927, they were defeated at San Julian. At Puerto Abristo, they left 600 dead. In November, the military attaché of the U.S. began to worry about the success of the so-called fanatics, 40% of whose troops were now equipped with excellent Mausers recuperated from the enemy. How was it possible? So in Colima, the first soldiers were, there was the priest, Father Enrique Ochoa, and about 12 guys. That was it to go face the several hundred columns of federales coming on their village in Colima, which is a state on the western side of Mexico, in the volcanic region. We took the boys there too and had mass up on the volcano. And during mass, you could see the ash settling into the chalice onto the altar cloths. So that was interesting. And the guide took us to a huge area where many martyrs were buried, the Cristeros. And we also walked through some of the tunnels in the mountains that they dug out. And in one range, they were looking down on the road between the lake and the mountain, and they were shooting down on the federales from the high position. And I have a bullet from that time. He gave me a bullet that belonged to the Cristeros. The boys met a woman she was a lady, 116 years old. They all gave her a kiss on the cheek. And the house was so poor. It was a dirt floor, and their oven was a brick oven. But they were so happy. And their son, who was like in his 70s, he gave me the bullet. And she was alive when the Cristeros were there. And she was one of the ladies that fed the Cristeros and did what she could to help them. So in Colima, the first army went out to face hundreds of federales, trusting in God. And the skirmish broke out, and soon the federales broke, and they turned and fled. And the Cristeros were looking at each other like, what happened? Turns out a spy reported that when they reported back to camp, the federales, they said there wasn't 12 Cristeros, there were thousands of them. And when we would shoot into them, there was a woman on a horse and another man on a horse, St. James and Our Lady. They would shoot at her and she would swallow the bullets. And it was the angels who appeared. And that happened in the Old Testament when Prophet Elias said, look, don't you see what I see? And he saw thousands of angels with the armies of the Israelites. So that happened at the beginnings of the Battle of Colima. And one of their generals was Dionisio Ochoa, the brother of Father Enrique Ochoa. And at one point they were camping out at night. And Dionisio woke up and had a dream that Our Lady told them, get everybody out of there. The enemy is coming through. And his right-hand man just woke up. And he said, I had this strange dream. Well, I had the same dream too. And the other one woke up. I had the same dream. And turns out everyone woke up. They all had the same dream. So the message couldn't be clearer. So they got up and out of there. And yes, within an hour, the federales would have massacred them. Our Lady saved them. Marvelous Cristeros, while the federal army recorded an average of 30,000 desertions annually, they did not experience a single case of treason. A cobbler became sector chief, was contacted by the enemy, who offered to spare his life and make him a colonel. And he answered him, I am not fighting for a rank. I am fighting for the church and for Christ the King. As soon as the victory is won, I shall return to my shoes. He was killed in combat in March 1928. Another husband, there's a photograph of his wife and her sister holding up his dead body. And this man ran out of ammunition with the cavalry coming on him. So rather than his rifle go to the enemy, he broke it in half, took the broken piece, made the sign of the cross, and was trampled, shouting, Viva Cristo Rey. One of the rules for the Cristeros, anyone who abducted a girl meant death. They were not to abduct any girls. But one Cristero, he didn't do anything. He just went off walking with the girl. And it was reported to the general, and the general said, "Why did you do this? I have to kill you. Why did you break code?" And the guy said, "Well, we didn't do anything. I was just talking to her." But he said, "Look, everyone thinks you abducted her. So I got to kill you." So he said, "Look, don't let my friends kill me. Put me on the horse, tie my hands, and let my enemies kill me." So that's what they did. They tied his hands, put him on the horse, spanked the horse, and he went marching and running into the enemy camp, and they just shot him. With diabolical tenacity, Calles' men tried to make their prisoners apostatize, but in vain. Father Reyes was tortured for 3 days and 2 nights. There's a photograph of one of these priests. He's all bloody, so you can tell that's torture. And they would fry his feet over fire and just stab him slowly. The pastor of Totalan, born in very poor circumstances as a child, he hawked newspapers, had decided to remain at his post. That was enough to unleash the hatred of the federales, who tormented him with fire. "You say that God descends into your hands. Well then, let him deliver you and descend and deliver you from ours." His torturers taunted. They finished him off with bullets on the evening of Holy Wednesday. One of them testified, "We had already lodged 3 or 4 bullets in him when he aroused himself off the ground to cry out once more, 'Viva Cristo Rey.'" Father Sabas Reyes Salazar was canonized on May 21st, 2000. That was Pope John Paul II. Well, we're always skeptical of those new canonizations, but these guys are certainly martyrs and saints. Another priest was Father Ubiarco Tranquilino. He would go and disguise saying Mass for people in his area, bringing communion, saying Mass, hearing confessions. He was captured, and we took the boys on this pilgrimage to this town. I forgot the name of it, Potitlan or something like that. And entering into the town, you drive over a bridge, and there's 2 huge rows of gigantic sycamore trees, hundreds of years old. And the one that they hanged Father Tranquilino on died. It's the only tree that died. And today I got some bark pieces off the tree, and it's a shrine, and they have a monument to this priest who was martyred in his full vestments on that tree, being the only one that died. Valencia Gallardo, a Cristero leader, was tied to a stake and tortured, but only cried out throughout the tortures, "Viva Cristo Rey." They tore out his tongue, he freed one of his hands from the chains, and pointed to heaven. They cut his hand off and then split open his skull with their rifle butts. Admirable Cristeros, the Cristiada was not a counter-revolution with its share of exactions. It was the opposite of a revolution. Read the order of the day of one of its generals killed in combat in 1927. So here's the disciplinary measures affecting the Southern Division. The division chiefs of the south of Jalisco, Colima, Nayarit, and Western Michoacan of the National Liberation Army have adopted the following measures. First, to render an official, public, and solemn homage to the Sacred Heart of Jesus, sovereign King of our army, and to humbly and lovingly consecrate to him all the works and all the persons of this division. Imagine that. Consecrate the Marine Corps, the Navy, the Army, the Green Berets to the Sacred Heart of Jesus. Imagine that. In Argentina, with the Falkland Island War, the military, the Marines of Argentina, their motto was Ave Maria Gracia Plena. Their first mission on the Falkland Islands was to bury a rosary. Number 2, to never omit under any pretext the daily group recitation of the rosary to the Blessed Virgin Mary of Guadalupe, and to accord this observance the same priority as a strict disposition of military regulation. Imagine the Navy SEALs marching, praying the rosary. It should be normal. 3, whenever possible, to arrange things to allow all the leaders of officers and soldiers to officially fulfill the precepts of Sunday worship, confession, and communion. 4, to guarantee divine protection during the battles by making the army and the Catholics prepare themselves by humble, confident prayer and by recommending making acts of perfect contrition. That was the code of the military. Their awareness of the supernatural character of their fight did not lead the Cristeros to neglect temporal realities. Fight and organize, fight and moralize was one of their mottos. In the liberated territories, administrators were appointed, Catholic schools were opened, more than 200. Public sins, drunkenness, prostitution were suppressed. So yes, there was victory after victory for the Cristeros, and they would always set up schools for the children. Who were these new crusaders? They were the people. As one federale wrote, "We run no risk of making a mistake by massacring one and all. They all resist." They were 95% rural folk, peasants, artisans, miners, muleteers, or rural landholders. There was, for instance, Luis Navarro Origel, who, with a degree in philosophy and a third order Franciscan, in 1926 he took the lead of the men of the village where he was mayor. He declared, "I am going to kill for Christ those who kill Christ, and perhaps die for him if need be. I am going to offer the blood of redemption." He fell at the head of his troops August 10th, 1928, at the age of 30. Another great man, Luis Segura Vilchis. I just met two ladies in Mexico not long ago, 2 months ago, with Andres. We drove down and visited two ladies whose father was a personal friend of the Pro family, who knew Father Miguel Pro, and they have his crucifix. So we got to venerate that, and they gave me some Cristero books in Spanish, which I hope we can translate someday and publish. But these two girls, ladies, their father would have died martyrs with Father Pro and Luis Segura Vilchis, Humberto Pro, and Jose Torrado. He would have died with him, but he slept in, like Peter. They slept in, and he missed his opportunity for martyrdom. But it was God's will, because he lived to give us to know these Cristeros, and they have another sister in California who I hope to see and visit. But anyway, Luis Segura Vilchis, he was martyred with Father Pro. Father Pro extended his arms, said Viva Cristo Rey with his rosary and his crucifix, and he was shot and went straight to heaven. Luis Segura Vilchis was a lawyer. He appealed to the authorities, saying, "If I tell you who plotted the president's assassination of President Obregon, will you let the others free?" They said yes. He said, "I'll tell you who did it. It was me." Of course, he didn't do it, but he was willing to die for his friends. But the Freemasons didn't keep their promise, so they executed all of them. And Luis Segura Vilchis, he refused blindfold, and he was best friends to the father of these three ladies. And when he stood before the firing squad, he opened his chest, pointing to his crucifix, and he said, "Shoot here, I'll show you how a Catholic dies." And they all, 4 of them, were executed, and all the people filled the streets singing Tu Reina Ras, a great hymn to Christ the King. The city folk who joined the Cristero were especially students and the women involved in the St. Joan of Arc brigades. Some of these 25,000 heroines were only 14 years old. So the movie For Greater Glory did show a good aspect of this, how the women were helping with transporting ammunition, medical needs, and information. They acted as liaison agents or scouts, nurses, collectors of money or munitions in the arsenals where they infiltrated as workers. Woe to those who fell into the clutches of the federales, hardened soldiers, but they never betrayed any information. What brave girls. They never spilled the beans on names or places. Beautiful youth of Mexico, Jose Sanchez was 14. In February 1928, he was surrounded by the Federales. He gave up his horse to the group leader, who was wounded, and covered his retreat. Running out of ammunition, he was captured. "Know it well," he said, "I am not surrendering. I have only run out of ammo." He was slaughtered. A note was found in his pocket. "My dearest Mom, here I am a captive, and they are going to kill me. I am happy. The only thing that troubles me is that you are going to cry. Don't cry. We will meet again. Signed, Jose, killed for Christ the King." So with that boys' trip, we also walked the mile that he walked. They cut off the skin off the bottom of his feet with a knife, an old Aztec's torture, and made him walk all the way to the cemetery for about a mile. Painful walk. And it was well portrayed in the movie For Greater Glory. And when he was in prison, he asked to go to the bathroom at night. The prison was the church where he was baptized. And they kept horses in there and the roosters for the cockfights. So in the middle of the night, he got up, gouged the horses' eyes, broke the necks of the chickens, the roosters. And when the boss found out, he was furious with Jose and said, "Why did you do that, you little punk?" And he said, "You don't turn God's house into a stable or a barn." So he was very furious, and that's partly why they martyred him. And the new movie that came out, I still haven't seen it yet. It's called Mirando al Cielo. You got to see it. It's very good. It's all about Jose. It's in Spanish, and it's very well done. Very well done. Tomasino was a member of the executive committee of the ACJM, which was the Catholic youth movement, called Mexican Catholic Youth Association, and the prefect of the Congregation of Mary. Arrested, he was offered his freedom if he talked. "Really, you would be making a mistake. Free, I would continue to fight for Christ the King. For us, the fight for our freedom of worship is not optional." In August 1927, he was hanged. He was 17 years old. Another boy, Manuel Bonilla, a student, kept a daily diary. "I well know that to do great things, God uses little ones, and that help does not come whence we were expecting it. I trust in God's goodness. All these sacrifices will not be in vain." He was shot at 22 years of age on Good Friday, 1927, at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. In 1942, his body was discovered perfectly intact. So he was martyred with Joaquín de Silva. Joaquín was 27. And when they were standing before the firing squad, Joaquín told Manuel, "Take off your hat, because very soon we will be before the throne of God." And when they were shot, Manuel also was able to shout with the last breath, "Viva Cristo Rey, Viva Nostra Senora de Guadalupe." The year 1928 was a terrible year. The infernal columns had received the order to deport the rural population to so-called concentration camps. 15-minute cities. Nothing new, is there? Where famine and epidemics decimated them. At the least show of resistance, the Federales would massacre them. Harvests and flocks were seized, grazing lands burned, and villages destroyed by the thousands. Sounds like all the food production in the United States and Europe blowing up, fires. Get a control of the food, and you'll starve the people out. That's always the track of communism and Freemasonry. Famine. And how would you like a nice, crispy cricket burger? That's what's also coming with these idiots, with these freaks, with these evil men. Despite this scorched earth policy, the Cristeros stood fast like latter-day Maccabees. In 1929, this was the fateful year of betrayal. The government renounced its policy of governing the countryside. The 3/4 of it was inhabitable. Mexico was in the hands of the troops of Christ the King. Victory was in reach, especially as the riffraff in Mexico were fighting each other, and in the United States, Hoover, who was not a Freemason, was elected. Then they learned that the secret negotiations between the Mexican government and the Vatican had resulted in an agreement. So Pius XI was Pope. The liberal bishops told him, there's useless bloodshed in Mexico. Order the Cristeros to lay down their weapons. When the fact was they were winning, and all they had to do was take Mexico City and establish a Catholic president. They were betrayed by these liberal bishops, who went up first to the United States and then to Rome. As one of the generals said, Gorostieta, he said, we don't fear dying for our faith. We don't fear our churches being burned. We don't fear any of these threats, but we do fear an agreement with the Freemasons, of the bishops with the Freemasons. We fear that. Just like we fear the agreement of Bishop Fillet with modernist Rome, and it happened. It happened. And now we're fighting on. June 21st, the Mexican Episcopate, except for one of its members, His Excellency Jose de Jesus Manriquez y Zarate, signed a resolution of the conflicts with the ruling power on bases negotiated by a U.S. Jesuit priest, Father Walsh. The accord, this agreement, provided for 1, immediate unconditional ceasefire, 2, the resumption of public worship beginning the next day, June 22nd, 1929. That was all. It restored them to the same situation that prevailed in 1926, with all the anti-Catholic laws then in effect, including the registration of priests. In the text, the Cristeros are called fanatics, directed by a few third-rate priests. Their revolt was an error, an imprudence, even a sin. They must lay down their arms under pain of excommunication. So the bishops ordered it, and the Catholics, trusting their bishops, obeyed, and they were betrayed, heavily betrayed, like we've been betrayed by these modernist popes and modernist bishops. Archbishop Lefebvre stood strong. His 4 bishops were supposed to stand strong like him. No compromise with Rome. Don't accept the new Mass. Don't accept Vatican II. Don't accept the new Code of Canon Law. And they all caved in, every one of them. And you might say, well, Bishop Williamson leads the resistance. No, he doesn't. He himself said it. I am not the leader of the resistance. He doesn't believe in it. He's the leader of the fake resistance. And his bishops are all silent. They're all silent, which is a crime against the sheep who demand the right of the bishop. The duty of the bishop is to teach the faith. And their silence is criminal. And many souls, Our Lady said, will go to hell because of the silence of the bishops. And when Bishop Williamson starts promoting the new Mass miracles, new Mass gives grace, we don't need structure, we don't need organization, we don't need seminaries. What is that? That's the game plan of the Freemasons. I'm sorry, it is. It is. Stifle any true uprising of Catholic tradition. They've all betrayed Archbishop Lefebvre. So pray for them, but we must not play their games. And pray that one of their bishops will at least have a spine and rise up and do his duty. And this secret consecrations and secret preaching and secret Mass here, and nobody knows where Mass is, nobody knows where bishops and dioceses retreats are, nobody knows. It's all secret. That's how Freemasons work. It's not how Catholics work. They're not the resistance. They are part of the Novus Ordo catch plan to those who don't want to go with Bishop Fillet, with Rome. They catch them and lead them to the same direction. It's all they're all working in the same direction. Sorry, but it's true. And another proof is, I wrote Bishop Williamson not long ago for holy oils. You know what he responded? And I'm not mincing words. He said, unless you start promoting the new Mass miracles publicly and give examples, I will not give you holy oils nor respond to your emails. Thanks a lot. I was ordained by you. You're my father. And I wrote him a very respectful letter. And I still have a great respect for Bishop Williamson. I do. I love him as a father. Pray for him. But he's betraying his role and the command of Bishop Lefebvre, who told the 4 bishops, don't seek an agreement with Rome. No negotiations. No agreements. No deals, no canonical recognition until Rome comes back to the faith and we have a perfectly Catholic Pope. Do we have a perfectly Catholic Pope? Far from it. Is it time for the agreement with Rome? They think so. And they've got it. They've got jurisdiction for confessions, marriages, holy orders. And they have to submit their marriages to the diocesan bishop in Kansas City. And they're all working under the diocesan bishops. Exactly what Archbishop Lefebvre said, don't do, because you'll be reduced to silence. So do you think Father Rutledge here in St. Mary's, the prior, you think he's going to attack this local bishop of Kansas City for his scandals and rainbow stuff and rock and roll masses and weakness on abortion? You think they're going to attack this bishop when they're getting favors from him? No way. They're reduced to silence. That's the danger. So listen to what happened to the Cristeros. That was all in that agreement. It restored them to the same situation that prevailed in 1926 with all the anti-Catholic laws then in effect, including the registration of priests. In the text, the Cristeros are called fanatics, etc. Colonel or Captain Jose Delgado, commander-in-chief of the Cristeros, Jesus Delgado, addressed his troops, his voice breaking from sorrow. He said, His Holiness the Pope, by the intermediary of the most excellent apostolic nuncio, has decided for reasons which are unknown to us, but which as Catholics we accept, that public worship will be resumed tomorrow without the law being changed. This arrangement has wrested from us that which is most noble and most holy on our flag. At the moment when the Church has declared that she will resign herself to what she has obtained, consequently, the National Guard assumes responsibility for the conflict. As for ourselves, as men, we have a satisfaction that no one can take from us. The National Guard does not disappear defeated by its enemies, but rather abandoned by the very ones, the bishops, who were to be the first to receive the fruit of our sacrifice and abnegation. Ave Christ, those who for you are going to humiliation, to exile, and perhaps to an unglorious death. With the most fervent love, we salute you, and once more proclaim you as King of our country. That was the commander-in-chief. Then 6,000 Cristeros obeyed and were immediately massacred. So they threw down their weapons in the town squares. The Freemasons, as usual, break their promise and opened fire on them. In 3 years, they had only lost 5,000 men in combat. On this day, they lost 6,000 more. The Mexican episcopate, the bishops, decreed the excommunication of the Cristero priests. They betrayed the Cristeros. But those who had been killed during the war, 180 priests, had already been martyred. All was lost. The new president, the Masonic lawyer Portes Gil, rejoiced. At the summer solstice banquet, he acknowledged his astonishment at the unconditional capitulation of a victorious army and his intention to continue the fight. He said, the fight did not begin yesterday, the fight is eternal. The fight began 20 centuries ago. So let it be told that the bishops gave the names of the generals to the Freemasons, and for many years later, they were hunting them down and hanging them on telephone poles, killing them. What a betrayal by the bishops. Indeed, but the novelty was that the Vatican was not on the right side. Freemasonry, condemned by all the popes from the 18th century, from Clement XII in 1738 to the end of the 19th century, with Leo XIII equating Freemasonry with Satanism, had infiltrated the Church at the highest levels of the hierarchy. Were not Della Chiesa, the future Benedict XV, and Cardinal Ratti, the future Pope Pius XI, were they not the proteges of Cardinal Rampolla? And Rampolla was said to be a Mason. He was going for a papacy with Pius X. Rampolla would have been elected if it wasn't for Joseph of Austria to veto the election. And then Pius X won. Thank God. If Rampolla was Pope, we would have had Vatican II in the 1920s. If you look at his picture, he looks like Count Dracula. In 1926, was it not Pope Pius XI who condemned Action Française in accordance with the sect's desires? In 1928, was it not Father Valette, the 5-day exercises? Father Valette was expelled from Spain and his work suppressed by the hierarchy that preferred to favor the Opus Dei. The Opus Dei is like Freemasonic clergy. When from 1934 to 37 a new Christiana was launched, Pius XI let the Mexican episcopate excommunicate the Cristeros and then waited till they were all dead before daring to write in his letter that he praised them. The same year in Divini Redemptoris, Pope Pius XI blamed communism for 3 atrocities perpetrated against Christians of Mexico, but he did not mention Freemasonry. Okay, now we come to the wrap-up here. Let's quickly wrap this up. 1. The saga of the Cristeros reminds us of the famous rising of the Vendée in France during the French Revolution. And the two epics have many points in common. First, the refusal of priests to take an oath of loyalty to the state. So many priests who stayed faithful, they would be driven to say Mass in barns, and St. John Vianney went to Mass in a barn, by these very priests. Many of them slept in chicken coops. Many of them were hunted down. And at Vatican II, who refused to go with Vatican II in the new Mass? It was Archbishop Lefebvre and his great, at the time, SSPX. And then in 2012, Bishop Follet slid and compromised. So now a handful of priests called the Catholic Resistance oppose that direction. Very similar. Just like in the Vendée, the faithful priests were in hiding. And the Catholics would not go to Mass said by priests who compromised and signed the oath of the civil constitution of the clergy. They would not go to those Masses. The altar boys wouldn't even serve them. And all that because they compromised on something far less serious than Vatican II in the new Mass. So when the SSPX accepted the new Mass, that's a major, huge compromise against the faith. Number 2, the creation of a state of schismatic church. The state puts up a fake church. Just like in England, the Anglican Church. Just like in France, the Republican Church, of those priests who signed the oath. Mexico, the Schismatic Church of Mexico. And now, since Vatican II, we have the Conciliar Church. 3, religious persecution. Look at Pope Francis waging war on the Tridentine Mass. It hasn't stopped. They've all waged war on tradition. Paul VI tried to smash Archbishop Lefebvre. Pope John Paul II tried to smash tradition. They will never win nor succeed. Religious persecution. 4, part of the episcopate's indifference to the suffering of the flock. Bishops silent and abandon the flock. Listen to this footnote. Listen to this. This was during the French Revolution in Vendée. A bishop, the letter of Monsignor de Mercy, Bishop of Lucon, in exile in Italy, deserves mention. On June 1st, 1793, he wrote, so here he's in exile in Italy. He was bishop in Vendée. And here's what he's worried about. Listen to this. For a long time, I hoped to be able to save my furniture that I left at Lucon. I might have, but the troubles in the Vendée harmed my cause, even though I do not take their side. So here he is, worried about his furniture when there were dying martyrs. Sounds familiar, with bishops more worried about Bach and Charles Dickens and New Mass miracles rather than protecting the faith and building seminaries and building for the future in this battle for the survival of the Catholic faith. And Bishop Follet compromising with modernist Rome and shaking hands with them, who Archbishop Lefebvre called devils. And then number 5, the character of the country folk at arms, poor, unequipped, unprepared, and undisciplined, yet courageous, joyous, generous even towards the enemy, and profoundly Christian. 6, the role of the women, wives who encourage their husbands and if need be chase them back to the fight with blows, as they did in the Vendée. The men were coming back because they saw the army of the Republic with drums and uniforms and flags, and they just had a few rifles and sticks and clubs and rakes. And so the Vendée men started to walk backwards and walk back over the bridge to their village. And the mothers and the wives who were praying there before the grotto of Our Lady, they saw their men coming, and they ran to them and smacked them in the face and said, "Get back out there. You're all we have left. Trust in our Lord. Trust in Our Lady." And they went back and they won that battle, actually. One of the mothers who understood that martyrdom is the crowning of a truly Christian education, Doña Guadalupe, mother of Luis Navarro Origel, would say, "I offered the life of my 4 boys to Christ, but the Lord came up short. He only took 2. So she offered all her sons to wage war with the Cristeros. 7, the clear warfare of Christ versus Satan. The shout of the Cristeros was "Viva Cristo Rey." The shout of the Federales was "Viva Satana," long live Satan. And lastly, the betrayal, the ultimate betrayal of the Catholic troops by the religious authorities. That's where we are right now. Betrayed by the bishops of Archbishop Lefebvre, who should be fighting for tradition, not compromising. Betrayed by all the Novus Ordo bishops. Betrayed by Rome. These similarities should not, however, mask an essential difference. The sole motive of the Cristeros was religious. The defense of the faith was not mixed with any other cause, be it political, social, economic, or particular. As the refusal of the draft by the Vendée showed. The army captured them, and the general commanding the Place d'Arandas asked them for whom they had taken up weapons to create such disorder. They replied that it was not to create disorders, that they had taken up arms to defend Christ the King, who was no longer on the altars. They were shot immediately. So that's where we are. We have to stand the last bastion, even if it be with no compromise with Vatican II and the new Mass. And we rally around the Immaculate Heart of Mary. We rally around with her rosary. That's our weapons. And under the banner of the Tridentine Mass of the Latin Rite. And the stand of Archbishop Lefebvre. His stand was clear. His stand was Catholic. And it's all in sync with the Cristeros, with the martyrs, with St. Pius X, Cardinal Pio Portier, Louis Voyot, and the great popes who condemned liberalism. With that said, Viva Cristo Rey, and we'll go straight to lunch.